Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I'm Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Ray.
As promised in episode 2, we're going to turn our attention to the realities of what was happening in the early days of the Danske Bank laundromat by looking in detail at some of the bank statements. Graham, you explained in episode 2 that there were some constraints placed on you in respect of the statements that you have. Do you just want to remind our listeners what they were?
Of course, Ray, but before I do, can I just mention one thing as a result of our previous 2 episodes?
Yeah, please do.
So, Ray, we've had a number of people get in touch with all sorts of helpful feedback and further bits of information. And first of all, I'm sure we'd both like to say how much we appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely.
Secondly, we decided at the outset the podcast should be aimed very squarely at the general public in a way that makes the story easy and accessible to them.
That can be quite tricky at times.
It can, and for that reason, although there are some really interesting byways down which we could venture, and some very curious and hard to explain elements that have been sent to us, and frankly, which we find very interesting, we may not always include them for fear of unnecessarily complicating a story without necessarily adding to the narrative.
Yes, agreed. And often, if we've got an investigation in flight, now is not the time to start talking to a bigger audience about it until we've resolved certain aspects of it. So we both love the intricate details, but it's important not to lose the bigger picture. Back to today's episode then. You were going to explain some of the constraints within which we're going to operate today in terms of the Danske Bank statements.
Yes, I was. So because there are ongoing investigations into many of the payments and people identified in some of these statements, we need to be really careful not to prejudice any future criminal charges. So whilst there's a lot I can talk about, I can't really name names except where they are already in the public domain.
That's fair enough. What are we going to talk about then?
Well, now listen, Ray, you and I have done our fair share of writing policies and processes and procedures.
That's certainly true.
And many of them have revolved around transaction monitoring and transaction alerts. So I thought it would be best to structure this conversation around the different elements that would be analysed when assessing an account to see if it has likely been used for money laundering. Now, you know these elements as well, if not better than I do. So do you just want to explain, Ray, for the benefit of the people listening, what we look for and why we look for them?
Yes, of course. I'm happy to. We look for things that we call red flags, which are things that are unusual, that require some sort of explanation that we don't feel we can overlook because they don't seem to represent the normal functioning of an account or a banking relationship. Now, at a high level, in terms of the transactions on someone's account, some of the things we look at include total and daily volumes, total and daily values for both debits and credits, individual transaction amounts, the remitters and the receivers of payments, and the average overnight balance.
Great. Now, let's take each of those elements one at a time and explain what we're looking for.
Yeah.
First of all, then, Ray, total and daily volumes.
Here we're looking to see if the volume of transactions is typical for the type and age of business or whether there are any red flags. For example, if it's a long-established building contractor, there will be a typical level of transactional activity which will look very different from, say, a newly formed computer consultancy. I can't say there are any hard and fast rules here, but as a rule of thumb, a new business is likely to have fewer account activities than a well-established and successful one. So this is a general measure to take stock of the business activity.
Excellent. And daily volumes?
Again, this is something of a general measure to see if the business is transacting on a consistent daily basis or if it's more unpredictable. For example, if you think about a retail business, that's more likely to have regular payments both in and out, even though it may vary by season or even by day of the week, than something like a management consultancy, which may be more ad hoc. As before, this isn't a specific measure to ascertain whether there's evidence of money laundering. It's just to get a sense of whether the overall activity is indicative of what one would expect or not.
Right, now that all seems to make complete sense to me. So what about total and daily values?
This is where it starts to get a bit more interesting. Self-evidently, a successful business should take in more than it pays out unless it's running at a loss, which means you would expect that the amount you receive by way of invoices, so invoices that you've issued and people are paying for, would be more than the amount you pay out in invoices, so invoices that people have sent you that you have to make payments for. The difference between the two would then be made up of other business expenses, rent, wages and other costs, leaving you hopefully with a surplus at the end.
Okay, and daily values?
One of the hallmarks of a laundromat scheme is the rapid movement of funds into and out of an account. After all, you don't want to risk your money getting frozen in an account if you happen to get spotted. So the idea is to move it on as soon as possible so that you don't get any of it caught when the music stops.
Okay, so you're looking for evenly matched daily credits and debits.
Exactly.
Got it. Now, what are we looking for then in individual transaction amounts?
A couple of things. One is amounts consistently just below a threshold, like 9,000 or 99,000 and so on.
Why is that?
Well, because banks often have limits at which their alerts kick in. Some are prescribed by law and others are simply based on the bank's own risk appetite. Of course, if the launderers have got someone on the inside of the banks, they may well be aware of those limits and consistently pay in just below them.
Or they might have guessed the likely limits, I suppose, or arrived at them through, trial and error in accounts that they've set up specifically to test the limits and see if they get caught.
Yes, that too.
Okay, you said a couple of things, so what's the other one?
Round figure amounts, Graham. It's an astonishing fact, but very often money launderers are just plain lazy and move money around the system in big round figures. And if you look at the average honest business account, these figures, except maybe when partners or owners take drawings from the company, are really quite rare. The consistent appearance of round figure amounts on a bank statement, unless there are good business reasons for them to appear, are highly suggestive of money laundering.
I've just realised this is turning into a very helpful tutorial for anyone new to the world of anti-money laundering.
Or anyone thinking of becoming a money launderer.
Quite. Let's move on. What about average overnight balance? I suspect this relates to that last element, doesn't it?
Yes, it's not just the individual sums that move in and out in quick succession. If you do that consistently across the entire account activity, the overnight balance will be very low in comparison to the total activity. It's a useful ratio to look at. A regular customer will usually not virtually empty a very active account overnight each day, but a money launderer often will.
Right. And then finally, remitters and receivers. What are we looking for here?
A few things, Graham. Firstly, is there any obvious connection between the remitters, the account in question, and the receivers? If the account's being used for money laundering, it might well be part of the layering stage of money laundering. Now, you'll remember that's where we move money, often rapidly, between different accounts and usually different jurisdictions to disguise its origins. Well, if that's what's going on, it follows that all three elements of the transaction, the remitter, the account holder, and the onward receiver, all have to be under the control of the launderers, because otherwise they've lost their money. They ought to go out of their way to mask those connections, however, and it's the job of the investigator to find them.
Right. And the next one?
The nature of the business that each of these elements conducts. Obviously, you wouldn't expect a fine art company to be doing business with the manufacturer of parts for a motor car, or at least not on a regular basis. I mean, they might be buying a painting for the ballroom, but you get my drift.
I do. Anything else?
Yes, one other thing that's worth mentioning. You wouldn't expect a firm that's consistently paid by you to consistently also send you money. So, I mean, you have firms that you pay, like suppliers, and firms that pay you, like customers, and normally those are two different populations. It's possible, I guess, that you both send and receive money from the same company, but it wouldn't be common.
Great. Anything else you can think of, Ryan?
Well, one other thing worth mentioning is that in this day and age, almost all firms have some sort of internet presence, and the more successful they are, the more likely they'll have some sort of online business.
Well, yes. I mean, even the little corner shops you visit locally these days are listed in some sort of directory. In fact, knowing we were doing this podcast, I did a little test. And every one of the shops in the road next to where I live, and that's just a small through road, were listed on at least one or more internet sites.
And that's exactly what I'd expect in this day and age. So if you come across a commercial firm, an ostensibly commercial firm, that has absolutely no internet presence at all, that's interesting.
It is. So let's just take a step backwards then. So are we saying then that if a set of bank statements hits, say, one or more of all of those different red flags you have just defined, it is a sign that all may not be well?
Yes. I think red flags are more exponential than cumulative, by which I mean that 2 red flags represent a bit more than double the concerns of just 1 red flag, and 3 is definitely much more than the sum of its parts.
Okay. Well, with all of that in mind, shall we start applying that logic to one or more of the accounts for which I have the statements in front of me?
Graham, let's do that and let's see how many red flags we can spot.
Okay. Right, so I'm going to start with the statements for an account that's in the name of a UK limited liability partnership, and I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. One, it is still possible to access a reasonable amount of information about this company because it's in Companies House. And two, LLPs were at the centre of the activity in Tallinn. We know that thanks to the evidence of whistleblower Howard Wilkinson, who revealed that it was his checks on first one and then a handful of UK LLPs that persuaded him to push ahead with his assertion that something was rotten.
In the state of Denmark. Well, Estonia actually, but we had to get that Hamlet quote in somewhere, didn't we?
Yes, we did. And Ray, I'm still optimistic we'll be able to work in the Tina Turner one, but we'll let our listeners wonder what on earth that means and wait for another episode on another day.
Yes, I think so. Meanwhile, if our listeners have any ideas about what it might be, they can always tweet the podcast. Tell us more about this account then, Graham.
Okay, so let's start with what we know about the company. So this LLP was incorporated on the 28th of June 2007.
And just to be clear, as we mentioned in our previous podcast episode, The Launching of a Laundromat, Danske completed their takeover of Sampo Bank in early 2007. So this LLP was created after that happened.
That's absolutely right. So this was not an inherited problem, not for this entity at least.
And Graham, I know you can't name this organisation publicly, but you know what it is. You've seen the registration details. Is there anything about the name or those details that give you any kind of clue as to what type of business this firm is involved in?
Ray, sadly not. You and I have written in the past about the manner in which a lot of these rather odd LLP names are devised. It has a name which looks entirely unremarkable but tells you nothing whatsoever about what it does.
Okay, yep, that's certainly part of the pattern. So what do we know about it?
Well, we know it was originally registered to a rather grand apartment block in Earl's Court in West London, which is or was home to a large number of very similar limited liability partnerships.
And do we know who the designated members were?
Yes, we do, but I think before we go into that, there may well be people listening who don't necessarily understand what a designated member is for a limited liability partnership. So do you want to take a minute just to explain?
Yes, happy to. A designated member is what you have in a limited liability partnership, which is the equivalent of a director in a limited company. And unlike an ordinary member of a limited liability partnership, the designated member has certain legal responsibilities in respect of keeping accounts, running the partnership and filing reports with Companies House. And there always has to be 2 of them. They can be legal entities, companies if you like, and they don't have to be based in the UK, although the limited liability partnership must have a UK registered address, like the one based in that apartment in Earl's Court.
Thanks, Ray. That's really helpful. So the 2 designated members for this LLP were called Ireland and Overseas Acquisitions Limited and Milltown Corporate Services Limited. It's worth noting that they were the designated members for a huge number of LLPs. In fact, using the really excellent service that's provided by Open Corporates, I found them listed as the designated members for 2,184 UK LLPs.
2,184, Graham. How on earth do you meet your legal obligations for so many at once?
Ray, you are so asking the wrong person. Anyway, over the years, they've given at least 2 and I think possibly 3 different incorporation addresses. I think they started out in Ireland, actually, but the ones I know, one is in Tortola in the British Virgin Islands and one is in Belize. And a lot of the LLPs they acted for, although, Ray, I have neither the time nor the motivation to check all 2,184, were registered to that same address in Earl's Court.
Okay. So this LLP was incorporated in July 2007. When did it open the account with Danske, Estonia?
It opened the account on the 19th of October 2007.
So within 3 months of incorporation?
Yep, and despite the registered address in Earl's Court and the designated members being based in the British Virgin Islands, the trading address on the bank statements is located in the Yaroslavsky district of Moscow.
Shall we start with some basic information? So, what was the currency that the account was denominated in?
Currencies, Ray.
More than one, Graham?
Yes. Swiss francs, Estonian crowns, euros, British pounds, rubles and dollars.
Okay, so in the space of 3 months then, this company had become something of a global concern.
Well, to be fair, not all of the different currencies started arriving straight away, but Ray, you haven't heard the half of it yet.
Go on then.
Well, the first transactions were in euros, and they started shortly after opening the account. So the first 2 credits arrived on the 2nd of November 2007.
For how much?
984,775 euros and 579,660 euros respectively, making a total of 1,564,435 euros.
That's not a bad opening balance.
No, especially as a further 945 odd thousand euros arrived on the 5th of November, and then another 984,000 on the 6th of November, and then 2 more totalling over €1.5 million arriving on the 7th of November.
Whoa, how much is that altogether?
Ray, it comes to €5,994,660.
So in the space of 6 days, a fraction under €6 million was paid into this new account.
Yes, interesting that so many payments were just under $1 million and the total is just under $6 million, don't you think?
Very interesting, but at least they've got a nice healthy bank balance.
No, they haven't.
What do you mean?
Well, they were also making payments at the same time.
Go on then. What was the bank balance at the end of this first week of frenetic activity?
It was €780.
What?
Yeah, at the end of week 1, they received just under €6 million and they paid out just under €6 million.
Gosh.
And then the dollars started arriving.
When?
On the 9th of November 2007.
I'm really going to regret asking this. How much was the first credit, Graham?
It was for $994,700, Ray.
So just under $1 million in dollars as well now.
Yes, followed by a further credit, same day, of $450,000 exactly.
Both on the same day?
Yep, a total of $1,444,700.
Sounds very familiar. Did they make any payments, Graham?
They did, Ray. On the same day, the payments totalled $1,444,016.80.
In matching amounts?
No, in round figure amounts. And by the way, the $16.86 were bank charges.
Who were those transfers to?
Well, as you know, I can't name names, but there were 6 payments to 4 different companies. All of those 4 companies were UK LLPs. 3 of them were registered to the same address in Earl's Court as the client account, and they had the same 2 designated members.
You are joking.
No, sadly, I'm not.
Okay, then. After that?
Well, on the 12th of November, they received a payment of $986,847.67. and they paid out $987,000 to one of those self-same LLPs, leaving a balance of $520.
And do the bank statements reveal anything about where the money was coming from or what the payments were for?
Well, yes, they do. So those last two, for instance, the credit into the account was designated for construction equipment, and the debit was designated as for electronic technics.
They don't really go together, do they?
No, and it goes on that same way, almost ad infinitum. So a couple of days later, there was a credit of $991,883.15 for construction equipment, and a debit of $992,000 exactly for electronic technics.
And it's like this right through the time the account was open.
Yes. I mean, to be fair, there is quite a bit of money being moved between the dollar and the euro accounts and back again, but there is also a very significant outflow.
What can you tell us about the outflows?
They fall into two distinct camps. They fall into layering transactions and integration transactions.
Should I just expand, Graham, on what that means, just to make sure our listeners understand the difference?
Yeah, I think, Ray, why don't you?
So, layering is the process of moving money around, often in a series of complex transactions, in order to disguise the original source. Integration is the process of reintroducing the funds to the real economy in a way that makes them look legitimate and then lets me go and spend or enjoy that money. If you like, layering is like shuffling the cards and integration is like dealing them.
That's a great analogy, Ray. That's absolutely spot on.
So looking at the account then, how do you differentiate between layering activity, moving money around, and integration activity, taking it out to spend?
Well, it's not a precise science, but a large number of the transactions are in round numbers amounts to unknown and often associated entities, whereas others tend to be non-round number amounts, and they are paid to specific individuals or to known trading entities or institutions.
Institutions, Graham, what kind of institutions are they?
Well, I've seen, for example, private schools and colleges. There's a payment in the statements I've got for fees for a private college in Gloucestershire. And then there's lots of payments to individuals which are labelled entrusting of money for the paying of property. And then there are payments to other entities, a good few of which are UK-based LLPs or limited companies.
And you discovered some interesting facts about the UK LLPs, didn't you?
I did. Across the 6 sets of bank statements which I've got, and incidentally that comes to over 5,500 pages of individual transactions, I identified 29 UK LLPs which appear repeatedly throughout those statements.
And?
Well, of those 29 LLPs, Ray, 18 were registered to the same address in Earls Court, and 5 more were registered at the same address in Cardiff. And if you check that Cardiff address on Google Street View, unlike the Earls Court address, which is a very nice mansion flat, the Cardiff address appears to be either an L bar or possibly the flat above.
So 23 of the 29 entities were located at just 2 different addresses. That's a posh mansion flat in West London and a nail bar in Cardiff, or possibly the flat that sits above it.
Yes, they do.
Okay.
And even more astoundingly, 23 of the 29, although not exactly the same 23, had Ireland and Overseas and Milltown Corporate Services as their designated members.
Okay, hold on. So you're saying that millions and millions of dollars and euros of transactions...
billions?
Okay, or billions... were moved through the accounts of a bunch of UK LLPs, 80% of which were either registered to the same address or run by the same people.
Ray, that is exactly what I'm saying, yeah.
And a lot of these transactions were conducted in round sum amounts.
They were. Can I give you an example?
Oh, please do, Graham.
All right, so on the 28th of July 2008, the account I'm looking at made 5 payments to 5 different UK LLPs. 2 of them were registered at the Earl's Court address, which is the same address as the account holder, and 3 at the address in Cardiff. 4 of those 5, along with the account holder themselves, had Arnold's Inn Overseas and Milltown as their designated members.
Wow. Not much doubt that they're all connected then. How much were those payments for?
So respectively, they were for €50,000, €210,000, €300,000, €320,000 and €374,000.
Whew. Anything else?
Yeah, I went through the accounts and I totalled up the payments for just one of those LLPs across the entire history of the account, which is actually about 14 months.
Okay, and what did it come to?
It came to just over €30 million.
Wow.
And a further $11.5 million.
Second, wow.
And they also received money from a second account I have the statements for, which totalled €6 million and $2.5 million, making a grand total received of €36 million and $13.5 million.
I mean, that's very nice going in the space of 14 months. Were they? I mean, this would have been a well-known, successful company.
No, they were utterly anonymous. But they did file accounts at Companies House.
Did they, Graham?
They did, but for 2008, 2009 and 2010.
While these payments were all being made?
While these millions of euros and dollars, yes.
Okay. Right, now, I'm going to have to ask it. What did the accounts show, Graham?
Well, Ray, in 2008, they showed income of just about £36,000, and in 2009, sadly, it had dropped to just over £13,000, and in 2010, down to £12,000.
I see. Well, okay. So far, then, we've found some interesting patterns in these accounts. We've looked at some very simple and obvious clues that a given account is laundering money, that if you know what you're looking for, stick out a mile. We've seen how the closing daily balances can tip you off, particularly when you also look at the total activity. And we've seen how round numbers can sometimes raise questions, and how connections between remitters and payees ought to ring alarm bells too, especially when new accounts start making sizable deposits and withdrawals virtually on day one.
Yeah, I think that's probably enough red flags for now, don't you?
There's more?
Oh yes, but there are a few other giveaways too, but I think that's enough for one day, so you'll have to come back for episode 4 to hear them.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to the second episode of the Dark Money Files, and we hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to listen to future episodes, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify or your normal podcast provider. Thanks.